Next, we speak one-on-one with Professor John Jackson from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Professor Jackson has co-authored 3 books on the presidential nomination process. We'll hear what impact the early primary schedule has on the Republican candidates in the race and how presidential politics are already altering the national debate on public policy. This runs about 20 minutes. As we enter the 2012 presidential cycle, you are the author of 3 different books focusing on the presidential nominating process. And so you've given quite a lot of thought to that process, and we thought our viewers could learn something from this discussion. Let us start as we are at this point. We are facing the Iowa caucus, and what are the early cycle states that come through the presidential primary process? And of course, this year we're focusing on the Republican candidates, as President Obama at this point has no primary opposition.
Well, the season's very much upon us, and really has been ever since the midterm elections. We have a full 2-year presidential election cycle. Unlike any of the other major Western democracies, ours seems to go on forever. So we are knee-deep in the selection of who the Republican nominee will be and who will run against President Obama, as you well know. We're pointing toward January of 2012 because the opening shots will be certainly the Iowa caucus, which is famous, the New Hampshire primary, which comes next, usually 1 week later. Those are the opening shots in what could be a very long season. We even have the forerunner of the Iowa caucus being the upcoming Iowa straw poll, which is nothing more really than a fundraiser for the Iowa Republican Party, but in August it will be held and will be an enormous event with major national and even international coverage, even though it's nothing more than a straw poll. So Iowa will certainly dominate, as my colleague David Yebsen has talked about earlier. Iowa will be first in early January, followed very closely by New Hampshire. Then the field is still not totally set. The officially sanctioned next primaries and caucuses are in Nevada and South Carolina. However, Florida and Michigan and several other states are trying to horn in on that, as they did last time, and that's very controversial right now.
You know, as it is currently established, we have those early primaries, we say. So we come out of Iowa, we go to New Hampshire. Have you looked at the peculiarities of those early primary states, and what impact those, if they do have any peculiarities, what impact does that have on the process of electing a president?
Well, that's a very good point, and different candidates are differently affected by the state that they're in and have different advantages. I think in Iowa, the fact that the Republican caucus goers there are very, very deeply committed, usually religious fundamentalists and people who are strong in the homeschooling movement, for example, became the backbone of the Mike Huckabee victory there in 2008. Those really activist people that you have to win the Iowa caucuses would seem to me right now to favor Michelle Bachmann, and possibly would be split between Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin if Sarah Palin gets in. The other side of that coin is New Hampshire comes up a week later. Mitt Romney should certainly be the odds-on favorite in New Hampshire. He spent money and time there. More importantly, Massachusetts, which is his base, dominates the media environment in southern New Hampshire, where virtually everyone lives. So everyone thinks Mitt Romney has an advantage in New Hampshire. So on the first 2, I could easily see Michelle Bachmann winning the first one in Iowa and Mitt Romney winning the second one in New Hampshire, and then we're off to the races. You get South Carolina next, and you get Nevada next, and you begin to sort of figure the odds for South Carolina probably favoring a Michelle Bachmann type candidacy. Nevada would certainly favor Mitt Romney. So here again we have the possibility of a very divided outcome even through the first four of the contests.
When we look at New Hampshire, we have I think, you know, their motto is live free or die, and they're known to be conservative economically. You look at South Carolina, they're more socially conservative. Does that, you know, what I'm wondering, are candidates free to run based upon their own ideology, or do they have to tilt their ideology to the preset ideology of the voters of those early states, lest if they lose, they're out of the contest before they've really had much of a chance to be introduced to the rest of the nation?
Well, the candidates have to appeal to the party base in the primaries and particularly in the caucuses, because the caucuses are so much smaller than the primaries, and thus you get the candidates being pushed to the hard right in the Republican Party and to the left in the Democratic Party by the composition of the electorate, particularly in those early contests, especially in Iowa and especially in South Carolina. You get very activist, very conservative, especially social conservative voters, and the candidates not only appeal to those people, they pander to them. So it pushes them to the extremes.
I know we saw some of that when we had back in 2000 then Governor Bush running against John McCain, and of all things we had in South Carolina this debate about whether the Southern flag or the flag of South Carolina that had the Southern stripes and bars in it should be flying over the Capitol. When you look at how some of these peculiar idiosyncrasies of debate come up, are we all well served or not well served by having the current primary system, or have you looked at, you know, would we be better served by having regional primaries such as the Northeast, the Southeast accordingly?
Well, the current system is haphazard and has been adopted by state legislators in order to advantage their state. They don't really care about the national interests. They care about filling up the hotels and motels and restaurants in their home state and getting the home state advantage. And so we have a crazy quilt of different primaries with different schedules, and everybody in the past jockeying to get to the front in what's called front loading. All of it forgets about the national interest in getting the best candidates. So I think it's time for us to think of some alternatives. I happen to favor a regional primary approach. I think that would be a much better and more representative approach, because none of these early states are representative of the American electorate. Now, I know there's a very good case that can be made for the so-called retail politics of places like New Hampshire and Iowa. Indeed, my colleague David Yebsen is a very strong proponent for that retail politics case, and I understand that case. I think, however, a regional primary system would be a better approach, and I favor it.
Any chance of that happening anytime soon? Is there much demand for something like that?
Well, there has been a good deal of discussion. The Republicans have been much troubled by their national party rules and whether or not they should change them. The Republicans were particularly concerned in '08 and again this year about front loading, about what it's going to do to their candidates. They looked at a regional primary system. Indeed, the RNC voted out an endorsement of a regional primary system. It was scotched in the National Convention, but they are concerned about that. They have also changed their rules. I don't want to be too technical here, but this year for the first time they have gone to something called proportional representation for all of the primaries prior to April the 1st. The Democrats have long had proportional representation, while the Republicans have had winner-take-all primaries. So the Republicans this year have changed their national rules, and their system is going to change fairly markedly. It could be the result of that, that the Republicans are facing a protracted battle as the Democrats faced between Clinton and Obama in '08. The Republicans could play the same thing out in '12.
I want to talk about some other things, but before we leave the topic of the primary system, one of the changes that are going to be effective this year is Illinois, which 4 years ago moved its primary up to early February just so that it could have the voters of Illinois help Barack Obama in the nomination process. Now the nomination, or the primary I should say, in Illinois is being moved back to where it has been more traditionally in March. What impact, if any, is that going to be having, do you think?
Well, if it's a usual year, Illinois won't count for much. Illinois did not count for anything between 1992 and 2008. Then all of a sudden we moved in 2008. That advantaged not only Barack Obama, but John McCain, who won the Republican primary with Illinois help that year. Dropping back to March, traditionally you would think would make us almost irrelevant again. On the other hand, if the Republicans don't solve their puzzle on Super Tuesday, which comes in February, there could be a top two choice that could be a meaningful choice for Illinois Republicans. But things have to work out just right for Illinois to have a role in selecting the Republican nominee for 2012.
Another area that you have written on and done research on is the area of redistricting, and this is going to be one of those years where we are redistricting the congressional seats and the House and Senate seats of the state of Illinois. Illinois currently has 19 legislative districts, and we are going to be losing one because of a loss of population, the shifting population of the United States. What are your thoughts on how Illinois will fare and who's going to lose out in that congressional district?
Well, we have lost population. We haven't lost population, but we have not gained population rapidly enough, thus we lose one seat. Everyone, I think, assumed that one of the freshman Republicans that was just elected in 2010 would be most vulnerable, and I think that will work out to be the case. They are not veterans. They don't have a long-term record built up. Republicans now have an 11-to-8 advantage in the congressional delegation in a state that is pretty clearly a competitive but leans Democratic state. The Democrats have controlled the governorship handily, for example, even though in a close election. So I expect that balance will be righted some, and the Democrats will pick up one or two. One or two of those freshman Republicans are probably the most vulnerable.
You know, when gamblers play poker, they talk about tells, little things that give people an insight into how the opponent is playing. As we look now, are there any tells that we can see? In other words, by that I mean every presidential election year has its own flavor. There are different issues that seem to be resonating, and right now, obviously we're knee-deep in this debate over the debt ceiling, spending at the federal level, which has gone up so much in the last several years, and we see the spiraling debt. Is that debate now going to weigh over the entire presidential nomination process, do you think, next year, or is it impossible to predict at this point, you know, what are going to be the major issues that resonate?
Well, some of both. Certainly the question of presidential popularity. What is the job approval rating for President Obama, which is in the high 40s, not the best it's ever been for an incumbent, but certainly not the worst either. So you can argue that either way, but job approval for the president, the economic growth cycle and the level of unemployment are the variables that you look at this far out. Those point to a competitive election. You could make a case that the president should be in trouble based on those. You can also make a case, however, that you can't beat somebody with nobody, and until you see who the Republican candidate is and how he or she shapes up in a head-to-head against President Obama, you really can't figure those odds. But certainly the major argument will be over the economy, how well the president handled the Great Recession that he inherited, whether or not his policies helped or hurt us getting out of that recession. That will be the contours of the debate.
Bringing it back home, and we'll wrap up here shortly, but on the redistricting issue, we have had a series of hearings around the state. Senator Kwame Raoul in the Senate was the chairman of the redistricting committee and remains so. They came up with a map. The Republican Party is now suing about that map. There's all kinds of supposed things they are trying to achieve as far as fairness to different groups to make sure that they're not isolated. But in your research, what's really behind the drawing of the lines of the congressional and House and Senate legislative maps? Is it a science, or is it really as simple as that the one who's drawing the map is going to try to take advantage of the party that they're running against?
Well, the losing party always sues. It's not at all surprising that the Republicans have filed suit. If the Democrats were in the same position, they would be filing suit. The only real grounds that the court will take and look at carefully are the grounds related to the Voting Rights Act. That is African American representation and or Hispanic representation. The other charges that they've raised, I think almost certainly won't stand up in court. Voting Rights Act are always difficult and thorny issues. Whether or not the Republicans prevail on those issues, I can't tell, but it really probably won't advantage them much in the long term anyway, because the question of representation for those two groups has to be handled first. Beyond that, it's all an art, and the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. These districts are not wildly out of shape. They are contiguous and reasonably compact in my looking at them. Not nearly as bad as some of the regions that were drawn last time, which were ultimately upheld by the courts. So it'll come down to that.
Well, Professor John Jackson, we appreciate you sharing your insights with us as we go into this presidential campaign, and perhaps we can come back and speak with you again as it progresses throughout the next year.
I'll be glad to talk with you again.
Thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Okay, thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.